Hi there! Following up on my review of Centaureissi skill kit, here's my promised how to build guide where I will delve into her keys, fortifications, gear options and some gameplay tips to round things off. While it seems that this time around most people lean towards skipping her, I hope that all mate appreciators are now proud mate employers. As usual, if you are unfamiliar with her skills or still unsure whether she's worth pulling, I suggest watching my previous review first where I cover her general gameplay along with her strengths and weaknesses in much detail. Without further ado, let us get started. Starting with her keys. The first key, Pre-Meal Dessert, grants the usual 3 extra confectance points at the start of battle. Since Centaureissi can regenerate up to 2 confectance points via her support actions, you would normally have to wait at least until turn 2 of the battle before you have access to her ultimate. Having this key equipped means that you can use her ultimate immediately, but since healing is not required on the first turn, this practically does not make a difference. As shown, she gained 2 confectance points on round 1. Now you see her gain her 6th confectance point upon her first assist on round 2. This means that if you withhold her action until then, you get to use her ultimate after the first single target attack on that round. Since the enemy only acts after everyone's turn, there is no critical reason to rush the ultimate at the start of round 2. However, this means one of her assists is not used toward recharging the next ultimate. Therefore, by having this key equipped, you effectively speed up the availability of your second ultimate by 1 round, assuming you used your first ultimate at the beginning of round 2 before any of her assists have been triggered. Moving on to her second key, Mate's Resolve. This key makes it so that she grants her own heat recovery buff to a nearby ally when they enter stability break. This key is somewhat of a double-edged sword. In situations where multiple attacks target an ally, this key can be a lifesaver. Even when the ally does not receive multiple attacks, you may still benefit from a synergy with her 6th key, which grants a random buff when healing targets with heat recovery. For example, Sharkry still has heat recovery active after receiving it via Mate's Resolve. Using Centaureissi's S1 now applies by chance a 10% damage increase to her single target attacks. With the same attack, she also restores heat recovery for herself. It is worth noting that the successful activation of this effect requires Centaureissi to maintain heat recovery on herself, and importantly, that no area of effect attacks have consumed it beforehand. As shown here, the boss uses a map-wide area of effect attack which breaks Sharkry's stability, but also removes heat recovery from Centaureissi at the same time, thus nullifying the key's effect. The reliability of this key increases when you reach her V3 upgrade, which gives her thermal cycling when she uses her S1. This buff essentially reapplies heat recovery after its removal once. Here, you see the map-wide attack from the boss again, which triggers Centaureissi's heat recovery. Then, thermal cycling immediately reapplies heat recovery. Now, Sharkry's stability breaks and she gains the newly received heat recovery from Centaureissi. With that said, keep in mind that Centaureissi's kit depends on having heat recovery active on herself. Without it, she loses her passive healing, her 20% damage bonus and the ability to apply overburn. Therefore, especially before her V3 upgrade, this key may put too much pressure on her heat recovery uptime. The synergy with her 6th key makes it worth considering though, when you know you are going into a fight with avoidable area of effect attacks or none at all. Next is her third key, Efficient Processing. This key has 2 effects in one. First, when an enemy attacks her while she has heat recovery, an additional buff is cleansed. Since heat recovery cleanses 1 buff by default, this means 2 buffs are removed. This effect is highly situational since enemies rarely carry multiple buffs. Secondly, Centaureissi gets cleansed of 2 debuffs when her heat recovery is triggered. Since the debuffing attack removes heat recovery first, she needs to reapply heat recovery on her turn. Therefore, you will need to have her S1 or ultimate available and position her in the line of fire to receive another attack so that heat recovery gets triggered. In this example, with some effort, we have 2 debuffs and heat recovery active at the same time. As demonstrated, before the impact of the next attack, both debuffs are cleansed. As you can probably tell, this effect is quite cumbersome to activate and only becomes slightly easier with her V3 upgrade, which helps maintain heat recovery. Still, this key may be worth having for debuff heavy fights, particularly when the debuffing occurs in an unavoidable area of effect. Thus, this key gets the verdict situationally useful. Her 4th key, Comforting Blend, increases the healing output of her 2nd skill. Normally, the skill heals targets in an area of effect by 150% of her attack. With this key, the output increases to 225% of her attack. The healing of her S2 is already quite strong if you manage to place it so that only injured allies are in its area of effect. And that way, no healing is shared with team members that do not require it, so increasing its output runs into the risk of overhealing. Moreover, since her S2 is rarely used, this key is not recommended. Next is her 5th key, Thorough Preparation. This key adds debuff cleansing to her active heals. Since her ultimate already cleanses 2 debuffs by default, this key mainly upgrades her other skills. Note that even though her S1 is an attack that heals as a secondary effect, it is still considered active healing and benefits from this key. Here, Sharpie carries a debuff, and once the healing from her S1 goes through, she also receives the cleanse. Keep in mind that her S1 only affects her allies. When Centaureissi carries a debuff herself, her S1 will still target the nearest ally, meaning she cannot use it to cleanse herself. To cleanse herself, she will have to use her S2 or her ultimate. Since the effect applies to her entire skill set and her ultimate can only be used every 3 turns, it is highly reliable and a great addition to her kit. This key should only be unequipped when you are certain that you are going into a fight where the enemy has no debuffs. Finally, her 6th key, Lucky Menu, adds a random powerful buff to allies who are healed while having heat recovery. Again, this effect applies to her entire kit including her S1. As shown here, I use her ultimate to buff both Sharkri and Chongju who have heat recovery active. As usual, the random buffs can be either offensive or defensive, and their usefulness is simply up to chance. In this example, Sharkri received a buff called Targeted Attack Defense, which grants a damage reduction effect that we certainly do not care about. Next to her, Chongju received a buff called Domain Penetration, which makes area of effect attacks ignore 20% of the target's defense. This is a less than ideal buff since she rarely ever uses her S2. Even though the effect is unreliable, it is one of the few sources of potential amplification in Centaureissi's kit, whether you have her V1 upgrade or not. Keep in mind that the healed targets need to have heat recovery active to benefit from this key's effect. In this example, only Centaureissi carries a buff, so when she uses her S2 on the group, she's the only one to receive a random buff. With that said, this is one of her better keys and should always be equipped. In conclusion, my recommendation for a fixed key setup is as follows. Thorough preparation and Lucky Menu should always be equipped. This grants her ample debuff cleansing and with some luck a bit of amplification. For the third option you can choose either Mate's Resolve or Efficient Processing. Mate's Resolve adds a potential lifesaver to her kit by transferring heat recovery to an ally, and it also synergizes well with Lucky Menu because you really want heat recovery active on your allies. However, it also puts more pressure on her own buff uptime, so you may find yourself struggling to maintain heat recovery on Centaureissi. If you are going into a fight where a lot of debuffs are dished out, Efficient Processing would be a preferable option over Mate's Resolve, even though the debuff cleansing applies only to Centaureissi herself. Before moving on to her fortifications, let us quickly address her common key options. Her own key Essential Hot Beverages applies heat recovery to the closest ally who does not have it every 3 turns. It is decent and helps maintain the buff on units like Chongju who do not trigger Centaureissi's support action. Since you should be running her fixed key Lucky Menu, having better uptime of heat recovery on your allies is always a plus. Unfortunately, the key boosts health even though Centaureissi mainly scales off attack, and only her passive healing is based on 10% of her own maximum HP, but that is a minor issue. If you crave more randomness, Xenia's common key Blazing Inferno works very well on her. Since heat recovery is a burn buff, she will constantly activate this key, even with only a 50% chance. With her V1 upgrade, she also grants Blazing Assault with her support actions, adding another accessible burn buff to her kit. Similarly, Cheetah's key, Over-Engineered Invention, gives a random buff with a 50% chance when actively healing. Since Centaureissi heals with all her abilities, this key's effect is extremely easy to activate. A noteworthy option is Papasha's key, Brilliant Metal. It grants a once per turn 10% damage boost to an ally's support action, which is the main source of damage for the burn team. The likeliest candidates to receive this boost are Chongju or Sharkri, so even though it activates only once, it is a reliable addition for a bit of extra amplification. Finally, if you are using her signature weapon, an honorable mention goes to Macchiato's key, Survival Instinct. Since her weapon requires her to have full stability index to activate its 20% damage and healing boost, this key can help mitigate the stability damage she takes, making the weapon effect easier to maintain. It also grants 5% attack, which is what Centaureissi wants above all else. Moving on to her fortifications. Her V1 upgrade is the only one which adds amplification to her kit. Normally, her support actions only apply heat recovery to the triggering ally, but with this upgrade she also grants a 15% attack and 20% damage bonus for 1 turn. The buffs are granted before the initiating attack, so they boost its damage, but they also dissipate immediately afterward. As shown here, Chongju gained Blazing Assault and damage increase. But once her attack concludes, neither of the buffs remain. This is unfortunate since the burn team mainly focuses on out-of-turn damage. To make matters worse, once your Chongju reaches V5, she applies the same damage increase buff as Centaureissi, so then her V1 only contributes a 15% attack increase. Overall, since she lacks amplification in her kit, this upgrade is worth considering, but its flaws make it insufficient to justify the investment. Next, her V2 adds many conditionals based on heat recovery and overburn, 2 effects that her kit centers around. In short, she gains more healing and damage when she has heat recovery, and she deals more damage to targets with overburn. This upgrade is a significant boost to her output, but her healing is already good and her damage is not the main reason to bring her. If content ever puts serious pressure on your sustainers, having this upgrade will make your life easier, but until then you will likely rarely notice its impact. As demonstrated before, her V3 upgrade adds the self-buff Thermal Cycling to her S1. This buff grants another heat recovery after the first one and is consumed by an attack. Since the effect is tied to her S1, she will always have both heat recovery and Thermal Cycling active, which essentially grants her 2 stacks of heat recovery. In this example she has both buffs active, and when the enemy attacks, heat recovery activates. Immediately afterward, Thermal Cycling is used up to reapply a new heat recovery to herself. I have mentioned before during the discussion of her fixed key Mates Resolve that this upgrade helps with the uptime of heat recovery, which is quite essential to her kit. With her V3, Mates Resolve becomes a better key option over efficient processing for most content. It is a nice bonus to have, but the one turn downtime of her S1 makes it not too impactful. Next, her V4 upgrade increases the number of debuffs her ultimate can cleanse from 2 to 3. It also gives it the ability to cleanse crowd control buffs, which are harder to remove. This upgrade doubles down on her ability to cleanse and makes her one of the best choices for that task. It becomes more impactful with her mod key, which allows her to cycle her ultimate every 2 turns rather than every 3 turns. Her V5 adds a new condition to her S2. Normally, the skill's total healing amounts to 150% of her attack and is shared evenly among allies in range. With this upgrade, the minimum amount of healing received is set to 75% of her attack. This is more impactful than it may sound when healing multiple allies. Here on the left there is a V6 Centaureissi with 2752 attack, and on the right a V2 Centaureissi with 2459 attack. In both cases, 4 characters are healed with her S2. On the right you have typical healing, which divides the 150% of attack by 4, resulting in a 37.5% heal that amounts to 1291 HP restored. On the left you would have seen a healing of 1445 without the upgrade due to the higher attack stat. Thanks to the upgrade, the healing amount is fixed to 75%, which amounts to 2890 HP restored. Essentially, her V5 makes it so that her S2's shared healing is at most divided by 2. As a side note, the healing she applies to herself in this example is higher due to her V2 upgrade, which adds a 50% healing bonus when the target carries heat recovery. With that said, this upgrade is quite noticeable when healing more than 2 allies with her S2. However, the skill is rarely used and only comes into play when you are really getting pressured by a lot of area of effect damage. Finally, her V6 upgrade improves her ultimate so that it restores 8 stability for 2 allies with the lowest stability index. Normally, it would restore 7 stability for only 1 ally. This is a decent improvement and will be more noticeable with her mod key, which lowers the downtime of her ultimate. I do not think it is worth pursuing, given the hefty investment costs, but it will certainly make her ultimate better. In summary, I believe the only upgrade worth considering is her V1, since she lacks amplification in her kit and this upgrade slightly remedies that issue. Still, the buffs last only for 1 turn, so they do not apply to out of turn damage, and the damage increase overlaps with Zhangju's V5. The other upgrades focus on her ability to sustain, though her V2 adds a bit of damage for herself when attacking targets with overburn. For free to play and low spenders, V0 is completely sufficient. For bigger spenders, V1 up to V3 is worth considering, since each of these upgrades adds something useful to her kit. After that, the return on investment is diminished as her V4 and V5 are quite situational and only her V6 is reasonably impactful. Continuing with her gear. Her signature weapon Mates Rules gives her a 320 attack and a 15% attack bonus. This base attack value is on the low end when compared to other SSR assault rifles. The weapon effect Sturdy Guardian adds 2 points of stability restoration to her active heals when the target's stability is broken. As mentioned before, active healing applies to all her abilities, including her S1. As shown here, Centaureissi uses her S1 with Shark stability at 0. Together with the healing, Shark stability is restored by 2. Having the weapon effect activate only on stability broken targets is quite restrictive though. Note that her S1 heals based on proximity, so if the target was not affected by overburn, only the nearest ally, namely Zhangju, would have received the healing. The weapon trait restores 2 points of stability to her whenever she heals allies, including herself. In the previous example, you can see that she also gained 2 stability points from this trait. Since all her abilities heal, she will benefit from this trait a lot, the only exception being her basic attacks, which see some use outside of high pressure battles. Finally, when Centaureissi's stability is full, her healing and damage are increased by 20%. This is why I recommend Macchiato's common key when using this weapon, because this effect is strong, but is held back by the strict condition. This effect appears as a buff on herself and remains active for as long as her stability is at its maximum. As soon as she is attacked and loses at least 1 point of stability, the buff disappears. When her stability is restored back to full, the buff reappears. Note that this becomes easier due to the weapon trait, which in this example restored the required 2 points when she used her S2 on herself. The same result could be achieved via the emergency repair set, though these are not mutually exclusive, meaning you can regain up to 4 stability using both. Next, the Guano from the Battle Pass is an extremely good alternative. Its base attack and bonus attack are identical to her signature weapon. The weapon effect increases both damage and healing up to 15% when there are 3 allies within 5 tiles of her. This condition is much easier to meet than maintaining a full stability index, making it a more reliable, although slightly less powerful effect. If you are a light spender who buys a battle pass, you really do not need to go for a signature weapon. If you are free to play, you can also use her SR weapon, the Sturmgewehr 36. As usual, SR weapons offer significantly lower stats, and lower attack means lower healing for Centaureissi. The weapon effect is decent though. In emergencies, when the target of her healing is below 50% HP, her effectiveness increases by 10%. Similarly, when she attacks a target with less than 50% HP, her damage increases by 10%. This weapon has the same trait as her signature weapon, restoring 2 stability points to herself after healing. In terms of stats, a better choice would be Golden Melody. It offers much higher attack, and its weapon effect also works for Centaureissi, although damage is not her main concern. Given that this weapon is tied to Changju and the 2 of them run together on the burn team, the only way to also have this on Centaureissi is if you had 2 copies of the weapon though. As a last resort, you can use Planeta on her. It has a good base attack value, but the crit damage does not really matter, and its weapon effect does not work for Centaureissi. It is really just a stat stick, and it is probably occupied by Shakri when you run her on the burn team. As for her attachment options, Emergency Repair is her best set to serve her role as a sustainer. With this set, her heals additionally restore 2 points of stability when the target's HP is fully restored. Since her healing is quite strong, this set complements her kit nicely. The effect stacks with her signature weapon effect, which restores 2 points when healing stability broken targets. Here, you see her using her S2 on Shakri with 0 stability. First, when the healing kicks in, 2 stability points are restored from the weapon effect. Then, after the healing fully restores Shakri's HP, she receives another 2 stability points from the set effect. Contrary to what the wording suggests, this also takes effect when the target is at full HP before healing. In this example, Shakri is at full health before Centaureisi's S2, and after the healing is done, Shakri gains 2 stability points. Lastly, Emergency Repair can only trigger for one character. With multiple sources of stability restoration at play, it appears that the set chooses a target with the lowest stability index at the time of its activation. To demonstrate, here we can see Shakri at 0 stability and Centaureissi at 6, missing 4 points. Upon ultimate use, 2 stability points are restored to Shakri from Centaureissi's signature weapon effect for healing a target with broken stability, and simultaneously 2 are restored for Centaureissi herself from her weapon trait. Next, stability restoration from her ultimate activates, granting 7 stability points to the target with the lowest index. Now Shakri's stability is fully restored, making Centaureissi the character with the lowest stability. Then, the Emergency Repair set activates for targets whose HP was fully restored, and grants 2 stability points to Centaureissi, even though Shakri had the lowest stability at the time of casting the ultimate. Since the stability restoration also affects herself when she is healed via her S2 or ultimate, it also synergizes with her signature weapon. In the example, the buff comes back online due to the set activation. Every bit of extra help is appreciated. Moving on, the only other support option would be Ultimate Pursuit. This set increases the healing from her ultimate by 5% with every use, up to a maximum of 20%. Since her ultimate needs 6 Confectance points and it takes her 3 turns to fully recharge, the ramp up for this set is too slow for her. It gets better with her mod key, which allows her to cycle her ultimate every 2 turns, but the healing bonus applies only to her ultimate and not to her other heals. Since a lack of healing is not an issue for her, this set does not improve her kit significantly. Therefore, Emergency Repair outperforms Ultimate Pursuit and should be used if you want to double down on her role as a sustainer and complement her kit. If you are not interested in more sustain or simply want to make use of the Phase Strike pieces you have lying around, that works too. In contrast to the previous options, this only buffs her damage, which truth be told is not too impressive, but it is the most stamina efficient choice when you already have decent unused pieces. As for her stats, you mostly care about attack and attack percentage, since both her damage and healing scale off attack. It does not matter too much if you have crit or a defensive option, since her damage is going to be mid at best. Of course, when running her on phase strike, crit would make the most sense, but these pieces are likely occupied by her damage dealers. You could add HP as a secondary stat since her passive healing is based on her own maximum HP. For instance, a piece with double attack and health is a good choice. You should mostly focus on getting her attack as high as possible, so try and find pieces with a high base roll for both attack stats. In this example, the upper attachment piece has the highest possible attack rolls, while the lower piece belongs in the trash bin. For more details on stat values and their impact on your calibration result, I refer you to my Weapons and Attachments guide. Before I let you go, let us have a quick rundown of some gameplay tips. First, when running her fixed key lucky menu, which grants a powerful random buff to heal targets with heat recovery, you want to ensure that your damage dealers have heat recovery active as much as possible. Since a character like Chongju mostly uses her ultimate without making active attacks, a good option is to end Centaureissi's turn close to Chongju while having her common key, Essential Hot Beverages, equipped. Here, by positioning her next to Chongju with her attack, we ensure that heat recovery goes to the right target. When she has heat recovery active on herself, and you do not require big heals, it is fine to use a basic attack. With this, all abilities remain available when needed, and her basic attacks still apply overburn. When her action concludes, heat recovery is applied to Chongju. Then, make sure your damage dealers get the benefits from her support actions. Since she only supports 2 single target attacks, this may require some planning with team sizes larger than 4. Even at V0, this applies heat recovery to an ally, enabling you to grant a random buff via her fixed key on the next turn. At V1 this is even more important, as you would otherwise be wasting the 15% attack and 20% damage buffs. On the next turn, both damage dealers have heat recovery active. You can either use her as 2 to heal both allies, or if a target with overburn is inside, use her as 1 to heal the 2 nearest allies. Since she lost her own heat recovery on the enemy turn, her S1 is preferable in this situation, as it catches 2 birds with 1 stone. As the healing goes through, both allies receive a random buff. Coincidentally, they both get a buff called Stability Offensive, which increases stability damage their attacks deal. It is not the most impressive buff, but we take what we can get. As you can tell by now, a lot of her gameplay requires correct positioning. Her S1 in particular should make you think twice before making your attack. As shown here, Sharkweek could use a heal and cleanse, and while she is closest to the target of her S1, she is not the closest ally to Centaureissi. Since the target is not affected by overburn before the attack, only one ally gets healed, in this case Chongju. While the previous position was perfectly fine for an attack that cares about dealing damage, it did not take into account the best position to support her ally. Here, we bring her closer to Sharkweek before making the kill, ensuring that the correct target receives healing. On a related note, Centaureissis S2 also requires proper team positioning for maximum utility. In this example, Sharkweek desperately needs healing. By using her as 2 in this manner, both Chongju and Centaureissi are inside the area of effect and share the total amount of 150% of her attacker's healing, which means every member receives only 50% of her attacker's healing. Since this heal is insufficient to recover Sharkweek's health, it is best to move the other allies out of the way, including Centaureissi herself. Now Sharkweek gets a chunky heal, restoring her HP back to full. Note that Chongju had heat recovery active, so by having her inside the area of effect, she receives a random buff via Centaureissi's fixed key. In this case, she would have received a useful 20% defense ignore buff, so there are always multiple factors to consider when determining your optimal character placement. Finally, for her rotation you are mostly alternating between basic attacks and her S1. Since the burn team revolves around single target attacks and overburn, both of these abilities synergize well. Not to mention that her S1 grants ample healing while dealing decent damage. Before her mod key, her ultimate is kept in reserve as an emergency button. Similarly, her S2 is only used when her ultimate is not ready, and her S1 is somehow insufficient. As mentioned before, ensure that her support actions assist the right allies, so plan your action order accordingly, and position Centaureissi close enough to the targets. And with that we have come to the end of this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it and perhaps even learned something new. It is quite unfortunate that Centaureissi's value was diminished by releasing after Suomi and right before Kluke, but perhaps she will gain a bit of popularity with her eventual reruns. In any case, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.